After hearing noises behind a wall, a family discovered something hidden inside. Every house has its particular creaks and groans. So when a family heard an occasional bizarre buzzing in their new home in Germantown, Tennessee, their friends and family told them not to worry about it. It would go away in time, they said. However, as time passed, the noise did not go away. In fact, the buzzing became worse. Night and day, the family heard the buzzing, but they could not determine where it came from. Soon enough, the family felt as if they were going insane in their own home. There was never a break from the strange sound coming from inside their walls. Eventually, the family broke down and began calling expert after expert to the house. Unfortunately, none of them could determine the cause of the sound. Until David Glover showed up. The family in this story, who wished to remain private, bought what they thought was an ordinary, beautiful brick house in Germantown, Tennessee, just a few years ago. Coming from out of state, the family loved their new home, as it was not only in a great neighborhood, but nearby to downtown as well. Soon enough, they had already become friends with the neighbors and began helping out at school. However, since they moved into their new home, a strange sound haunted the family. Since the house was a bit old, the family expected to hear the occasional creaky floorboard, but this buzzing was unlike anything they had heard before. To make matters worse, they could not even determine the location of the sound. As the sound became incessant, the family decided they needed to take action. The noise was not just annoying, but its maker could be seriously damaging the home, especially if it was a rodent. While rodents typically make a distinctive clicking noise, the family decided not to take any chances and called a pest control service. Immediately, the pest control servicemen did provide some help. They determined the source of the noise. It seemed to be coming from the back of the house, in one of the outer brick walls. Afterward, the company marked the walls and put in as much pesticide as possible. Hopefully it would kill the unwanted rodents, or at the very least, force them to leave. With the work completed, the family hoped they could go back to living their quiet lives. To the entire family's disappointment, the pest control company did not help at all. Despite the pesticide injections, the annoying noise remained. What's more, the family started to hear it all the time, and they were tired of it. However, they were not sure what to do next. After all, the pesticide should have killed whatever was inside the walls. Soon enough, the homeowners started to lose hope. Even worse, they had no idea how to identify the problem. Left alone, in their description, the family began turning to some pretty strange ideas to try and find answers. Since the pesticide failed to make the sound go away, the family started thinking about other things that could cause such a strange noise. Believe it or not, they even considered the possibility of their house being haunted. Whatever was making the sound should have been killed by the pesticide. While this might seem a bit over the top, the family was running out of options. They even considered sprinkling holy water on the wall and contacting a local priest to perform an exorcism on the house. Finally, someone in the family thought of looking at a new location for help. Soon enough, the family turned to the internet, as so many of us do with our problems. They had searched on Google before, but it seemed like no one had experience with a buzzing like the family heard. So as a last-ditch effort, they decided to actually ask the internet for help themselves. Of course, within moments of posting on different internet forums, plenty of users answered their post. However, to the family's surprise, it seemed like they were dealing with a one-of-a-kind problem. None of the users could agree on an answer, and many asked for even more accurate description of the sound. So the family decided to sit for hours, remaining as quiet as they could, to truly listen to the mysterious sound. At first, most of the family didn't think that listening closer would help them hear anything new. After all, they had lived with the buzzing sound for weeks now. However, once they turned everything off and listened, the family did notice something new. The walls seemed to be vibrating. Suddenly, the family realized that only something living could cause vibrations like that. Now it appeared that the thing living in their walls was more alive than ever before. After they posted their observations online, many users agree. Only a living creature or creatures could cause that kind of noise. However, why the pesticide did not work was anyone's guess, but the online community did have some ideas for the desperate family. Everyone online agreed the family should carefully keep an eye on the area where the buzzing was the loudest. Hopefully, by doing so, they could catch whatever was living in the wall, escaping from or returning to its home. So the family decided to keep a close eye on things. as well as they could. Meanwhile, the homeowners began to have serious discussions about selling the house. If they could not stop the sound, it would drive them crazy. Then, one day, while out in the backyard, one family member noticed a curious little creature flying over the buzzing wall. One day, while working in the backyard, a family member decided to approach the wall and take a closer look. As always, they heard the buzzing and vibrating clearly and loudly. However, this time around, the family member also spotted what looked like a little bug crawling around the window. Looking closer, they realized it was a common bumblebee. At first, a family member thought nothing of it. After all, Tennessee has plenty of bees. But when the little bee crawled into the wall and did not return, it got the family member to thinking, could it indeed be that one tiny bug had caused all that buzzing? Instead of trying to figure it out themselves, the family decided to turn to an expert. One bee is hardly indicative of a significant insect problem. However, the family was out of answers. So after surfing the internet for a couple of hours, they found the perfect bee expert for the job. Even better, the expert, David Glover, seen below, was local and free to help them. But how? Well, most importantly, if they did have a bee problem, Glover would remove the insects without killing them. You see, if Glover discovers that the bees were indeed the cause of the bizarre, buzzing sound, the family wanted to get rid of them. However, they didn't want to harm them in any way. Since bees are currently on the decline, but first, Glover would need to come and inspect the house. If you ever find yourself having a bee problem, David Glover is the man you want to call. In fact, Glover is widely known as the bee whisperer. You might think that you can call any old pest control company if you have bees. Unfortunately, they are more likely to kill the honeybees. On the other hand, people like Glover try to save and relocate the bees. For those unaware, bees are on their way to becoming an endangered species. Plus, once he's able to rehome the bees on his bee farm, Glover gets tasty honey in return, which he later sells. However, first, Glover would need to determine if the bees were even the source of the family's annoying noise. As Glover told the family on the phone, just because they have spotted a few bees did not mean that they were causing the problem. He then asked the family to check a few things first, to confirm whether or not bees were causing this annoying noise. Most importantly, he asked them to touch the wall and see if it felt warmer than the rest of the wall. It did. With that confirmation, David Glover knew that he was the right man for the job. After all, very few people have earned the nickname the Bee Whisperer. At that point, Glover decided to visit the homeowners to examine the wall for himself. Only after checking out the house for himself did the beekeeper really understand what he was dealing with. The day after their phone call, David Glover arrived at the house and took charge of the investigation. First, he tried to calm the owners, assuring them that he would thoroughly check the wall in question, seen below. Next, he removed all the tools he would need to check the house out of his fans. Of course, Glover's most important tool is his full-body bee suit. However, this is just one part of his arsenal. He also has thermal imaging cameras, smoke dispensers for calming the bees, and massive boxes to transport them in. Soon enough, Glover was suited up and ready to take a look at the wall. While Glover is extremely good at what he doesn't have superpowers. So, to see whether or not there are bees stuck inside the wall, he needs to use a thermal imaging camera. You see, the special piece of equipment helps him see if there's a heat source inside a wall. Believe it or not, 20,000 or more bees can live together inside a hive. And when that many bees get together, they produce quite a lot of body heat. When Glover uses his camera, he's looking for warm colors. The closer to red, or the darker the shades of red, the hotter the object. And when the bee whisperer looked at the family's wall with his camera, it turned dark red. When Glover put on his camera, he saw the most significant red spot he had ever seen in his entire life. Later, he said he simply could not believe what his eyes were seeing. Taking a closer look, he realized that the heat source made a trail back to a small hole next to the window. This must have been their entry point. Now the bee whisperer knew it for sure. The family had a severe bee problem. While Glover wanted to help this family, he also knew this would be his most difficult bee removal of all time. Was he up to the task? In the end, nothing could have prepared him for the largest he had ever seen. However, before Glover could even begin to think about the incredibly difficult job, he would first need the family's approval. After all, removing the bees safely from the house would also mean causing some damage to the exterior wall, possibly the interior also. Thankfully, after explaining to them the gravity of the situation, The homeowners agreed to let Glover do his job. Once given the go-ahead, the bee whisperer began to plan to demolish part of the wall to get to the hive. Meanwhile, the family just felt happy the end of their noisy nightmare was finally in sight. David Glover hates nothing more than working with bricks, and the family's entire house was made of bricks. Bricks easily crumble away, causing harm to bees, but are often so difficult to remove in their entirety. As a result, the methods needed to remove them can make the bees more aggressive and the whole job more difficult and dangerous. As the bee whisperer started to remove the bricks, he had no idea what he was getting himself into. However, he also knew that this had to be one of the biggest beehives anyone had ever discovered. The suspense was killing him. After Glover removed just one brick, his discovery left him in total shock. Just taking away one brick allowed him to see that there was quite a big space between the brick exterior walls and the interior walls. Inside, he found a massive beehive that he could not even see the edges of. Thankfully, the bees all seemed happy and healthy. Now that he could see the hive, Glover estimated that they had been there for quite some time. Months at least, if not longer. Still, with this small glimpse, the bee whisperer could not be sure just how large the hive was. After taking a few minutes to watch their patterns and behaviors, David Glover felt happy to see that at least the bees were safe and healthy. Still, with their hive now exposed, the bees began to become frantic. Within moments, hundreds of bees had swarmed around him, trying to identify the intruder. However, believe it or not, the most challenging part was still yet to come. As the bee whisperer slowly removed each brick, he started to realize that the project would take him hours, if not days. Not one to give up, Glover put his head down and got to work, all the while making sure he did not do something that could endanger the family. In the end, it took Glover over 5 hours to remove all the bricks that he needed to, and finally reach the beehive. He needed to take extra time and care for 2 main reasons. First, Glover did not want to damage or upset any of the bees. Just imagine if he killed the queen or caused a swarm in the family's neighborhood. Meanwhile, the bee whisperer also had to keep the homeowners in mind. You see, it would have been much easier to simply smash the bricks. However, Glover made sure to keep their repair expenses small and the structure of the home intact. Meanwhile, as he continued to remove the bricks, Glover couldn't believe what his eyes were seeing. David Glover was overwhelmed and excited when he continued to watch the beehive grow larger and larger with each brick removed. While it meant that he would have to work more, he was happy to do so. The more he worked, the more Glover realized that the bees had been stuck there for a long time, so he felt happy to help them out. Plus, Glover could not wait to see the largest beehive he had ever seen. However, the more bricks he took away, the more the bee whisperer realized the severity of the situation. Soon he started to worry that he wouldn't have enough supplies to get all the bees to their new homes safely. After a long day of work, Glover finally removed all the bricks he needed. The sight of the beehive left him completely stunned. Afterward, the bee whisperer named the honeycomb seen below Holy Huge Honeycomb. As you can see, the beehive is absolutely massive. In fact, based on the size, Glover was surprised that the bees had managed to stay alive for so long. The size indicated that they had been alive in the house's walls for years. When Glover tweeted some pictures, his followers on social media freaked out. After all, no one had ever seen a beehive this big. However, Glover now faced the daunting task of removing the bees and bringing them to his farm. When Glover first arrived at the house, he had no idea that rehousing the bees could turn into such a massive project. Moreover, he never expected to find the biggest beehive of his career. Luckily, he was prepared and knew exactly what he had to do. What makes Glover so special and good with bees is that he has the ability to make them stay calm. What's more, Glover knows that it takes a lot of calmness and bravery to work with bees and not freak out. Fortunately, Glover had all the tools he needed to deal with this unusual situation, and it was looking like he had enough to save all of the bees. Then the bee whisperer discovered something heartbreaking. As Glover began inspecting the entire beehive from top to bottom, he noticed something that broke his heart. At first, he and the family had thought that none of the pesticides had reached the bees. However, he later discovered this was wrong. It had, in fact, killed a portion of the hive and some bees. To make matters worse, the queen was, unfortunately, among the bees that were killed by the pesticide. In case you didn't know, without a queen, the rest of the hive cannot survive. That's because the queen bee is the one responsible for keeping the hive and repopulation in order. Without a queen, Glover began to think that all his work had been in vain. Usually, when the queen bee dies, the rest of the beehive becomes aggressive and misbehave. As a result, the hive fails and dies. However, that wasn't the case of this particular beehive. What's more, they were all very well behaved, and David started to feel optimistic about their future. As he began to look at the bees closer, Glover made another exciting discovery. Usually the honeycombs are divided into many smaller, broken-up sections. But believe it or not, this gigantic hive was made of just 2 enormous honeycombs. As it turns out, Glover had not just stumbled across one of the largest hives ever found, but also one of the largest single honeycombs ever. After taking a small sample of bees, Glover concluded that there were 35,000 of them. Yes, that's right. Thankfully, he had ultimately brought enough supplies to transport them all. However, that didn't mean he could save them all. Usually, most of the bees will stick close to the honeycomb when he removes them, as they want to stay close to the hive. Unfortunately, some are bound to be left behind. Most beekeepers just see this as the cost of doing business. But not the bee whisperer. Instead, he devised his own way of making sure every last bee he rescues ends up in a new home. As unbelievable as it might seem, Glover actually uses a gentle suction vacuum cleaner to capture the bees that stay behind after he moves the honeycomb. At the family's brick house, the bee whisperer managed to capture almost every single one of the 35,000 bees in the hive. Finally, the family could rest, knowing that the vibration and buzzing would no longer bother them, all thanks to David Glover. Meanwhile, back at his home, Glover moved the massive hive to vertical hive and became their beekeeper. Not only that, but he hoped that the bees would even start producing some honey. But for that, Glover would need to find them a new queen. For those who don't know, bees can't make honey unless they have a queen. So Glover needed to find the beehive a new queen. First, Glover planned on trying to transport a queen from another, older hive of his to the new one. However, this wouldn't be as easy a task, since the bees often reject a new queen. Before long, the moment of truth arrived. As soon as Glover inserted the new queen, the rest of the bees instantly became aware of her. Within seconds, they started to fly around and inspect the new queen. While the bee whisperer observed them nervously, it seemed as if they didn't want to have anything to do with the new queen. Fortunately, it all turned out well. The bees ended up bowing down to their new queen and started getting along with her. What's more, it didn't take long for Glover to notice eggs in the honeycomb. In due time, the beehive was working hard every single day. Meanwhile, everyone became excited and fascinated when they heard of the beehive on Glover's YouTube channel. Not only had they managed to survive for quite some time inside the house's wall, but they were also able to adjust pretty quickly to their new home and new queen. After a little more observation, Glover assumed that the hive had been growing inside the walls for about 2 years. Believe it or not, the bees adjusted so well to the new home and queen that they started making honey right away. As soon as they began producing, Glover knew that all his hard work was well paid off. Not only that, but he knew that his rehoming job was finally done. Without a doubt, this has been the most difficult challenge in his bee removal career. Of course, David Glover felt incredibly happy to have been able to save over 35,000 bees. Meanwhile, the insects started making so much honey that he didn't know what to do with it all. 6 months after Glover rescued the beehive from the family's home, he decided to post an update on his social media account regarding the insects' health. What's more, he wanted to let his followers know that the bees were feeling incredibly well and that they all loved their new queen. In fact, all the worker bees wished to get close to her. Meanwhile, the homeowners hoped that they would never have to deal with bees in their walls again. Still, they are happy to know that they made the right call asking Glover to help them. They were proud of themselves that they helped this beehive get a better life, while getting themselves a better night's sleep.